day at my first line, and that is Tony+Cartledge is a Georgia peach. I've just been waiting to say that. He took his first degree at the University of Georgia, and then he saw the light and moved to North Carolina for his MDiv at Southeastern Seminary and his PhD in Old Testament at Duke University. Tony has pastored 5 churches. I think they're all in the state of North Carolina.
No, 2 in Georgia.
3 in North Carolina and 2 in Georgia. But in some ways has pastored probably tens of thousands, especially of Baptists, through his extensive writing and also through his work as editor of the Biblical Recorder, the state newspaper here in North Carolina, state Baptist newspaper. Along the way, Tony's addressed lots of topics of interest for Baptist historians, and so we're going to hear about one of those topics tonight. Presently, Tony is professor of Old Testament at Campbell University Divinity School and is a contributing editor for Baptist Today. In addition to all these things, and more I haven't named, Tony is my colleague and good friend, so I'm particularly happy to welcome him to speak to us tonight. His paper is entitled Samuel+Cartledge and the Long Arm of Daniel and Martha+Stearns+Marshall. And it's a wonderful paper where his own family history and Baptist history intersect, so I think we'll all be enthralled.
Thank you, Lydia. Most of you who know me at all know that church history is not really my forte, but I promise you I have footnotes for everything I'm going to say. And I made an effort to do a historian's job on this. If you have spent much time perusing early Baptist activity in Georgia and South Carolina, as well as well, some of this will play into North Carolina and some other places, but in Georgia and South Carolina, you may occasionally run across the name of Samuel+Cartledge, who was an active church planter and pastor in both of those states from 1790 until 1843. The old parson gets a brief historical sketch in a variety of publications, but they're invariably incomplete and often inaccurate. Most often, he is mentioned in connection with the most infamous event of his life. Samuel+Cartledge was fingered as the stern constable who once arrested Daniel+Marshall for daring to preach his Baptist heresy in the royal colony of Georgia. That was in 1770. So my goal today is to paint a more comprehensive and worthy picture of Samuel+Cartledge, who was known to his colonial peers as Saul of Tarsus, as well as, in the process, to illustrate one aspect of the long legacy left by Daniel and Martha+Stearns+Marshall, 2 of the most effective early Baptist pioneers in the Southeast, and whose name we often call to mind. Samuel+Cartledge was born July the 15th, 1750, on his father's large plantation a few miles west of present-day Rockingham, North Carolina. His religious ancestry was quite varied. His great-grandfather, Edmund+Cartledge, had been among the first Quaker settlers to come over with William Penn when he began his holy experiment in Pennsylvania. Edmund and his wife Mary hailed from the English town of Riddings, located in the Darby County parish of Alfreton, and in 1682 or early 83, they arrived with some others from the same area and settled near Philadelphia in a new Quaker town that they affectionately named Darby. Records of the Darby monthly meetings from England or from that place contain a certificate on which Edmund and Mary were received from what was called the Breath House monthly meeting in Darby County, England, signed by 20 persons. It attested that the couple have lived honestly both toward God and all men, as far as we know since ye came among us, which has been many years. As a large landowner, Edmund was highly respected in Darby. He served often as a Chester County juror, as well as a constable in 1685 and a supervisor in 1692. His devotion to the peaceful Quaker movement apparently failed to rub off on his 2 sons. John and Edmund II+Cartledge became prominent Indian traders. They often did business with James Logan, who was William Penn's secretary. Each of them had trading posts near the Native American town of Conestoga on Conestoga Creek, which was a tributary of the Susquehanna River. John moonlighted as an interpreter for the Delaware Indians and an Indian agent for the proprietary. Edmund was less politically involved, but perhaps more venturesome. In 1727, along with 3 other men, he was the first Englishman to cross the Allegheny Mountains and trade with the Indians along the Ohio River and its branches. Although Quaker meetings were once held in John's home, the fur trade apparently necessitated a change in the brothers' lifestyles. Frederick Tolles, a biographer of James Logan, once described John and Edmund Cartledge as crude, raffish, violent, backslidden Quakers. While he may have overstated the case, there was clearly some truth in his accusations. John, for instance, was not above hiring a band of Indians to drive a squatter from his house and burn it. In 1722, both John and Edmund were involved in an altercation with a drunken Indian after they had supplied him with a quantity of rum. The Indian died. The brothers were imprisoned, though it seems that John was the primary participant. An Indian named either Sockham or Sachem, Sockham might be more appropriate, reportedly speaking for the great king of the 5 nations, that is the Iroquois chief, interceded for the Cartledge brothers and they were freed. John, however, who some speculate may have been injured in the fight, died within the year, but not before he was disowned by the Quakers. Edmund, too, who was Samuel's grandfather, regained his respectability, but disappeared from Quaker records in an early period. In 1732, he and his family moved to a grant of land from Lord Baltimore in Prince George's County, Maryland. There he continued his work as a prominent Indian trader until his death. With the approach of the colonial wars in 1739, the fur trade was ruined, and many Pennsylvanians moved southward, and among them was Edmund III Cartledge, the son of Edmund II and the father of Samuel. He arrived in North Carolina in the 1740s and quickly established himself as a prosperous farmer and justice of peace. About the same time, he left his Quaker faith and joined the Anglican Church. A variety of factors may have prompted that decision. His father, who was a frontiersman, had not firmly maintained the Quaker faith, and Edmund had grown up in a region fraught with religious turmoil. Robert Ramsay notes that in 1739, the bitterness arising out of the clash of 4 or 5 antithetical beliefs combined with the boundary controversy to produce considerable unrest at the head of the Chesapeake. Quakers and Deists, Presbyterians and Baptists and Catholics were all making their presence felt, and along with that, the growing prosperity of the Cartledge family would have probably created some tension with the simplicity of life and aloofness from this world that was taught by the Quakers. Edmund III was not the only Quaker to desert his inherited faith about this time. Ramsay mentions that many who left their friends did so because of political expediency, especially those who were more prominent may have found it expedient to abandon Quakerism in order to qualify more readily for sheriff, clerk, justice of the peace, constable, tax collector, and other lucrative public trusts. Since Edmund served as a justice of the peace for many years, as well as town commissioner, that factor may well have influenced him. He was awarded 1,240 acres of land in 3 separate grants, so apparently the change paid off quite handsomely. That plus additional purchases made Edmund such a large landholder that the large creek running through much of his property was called Cartledge Creek and remains so to the present. Some of you are aware there is a Cartledge Creek Baptist Church located nearby. Edmund had nothing to do with Cartledge Creek Baptist Church, only the name of it. And you may, those of you from North Carolina remember that it was at this church that the early North Carolina Baptist Convention first approved the establishment of Wake Forest University. A final contributor to the shift in Edmund's religious leanings could have been the most significant. He married an Anglican woman. If he had not already left the Quakers, they would have left him after his marriage in 1743 to Elizabeth Keble, which took place in the Anglican Church of the parish Prince Frederick Winyall in what later became Craven County, South Carolina. She was a part of the Campbell family, which included John Campbell, who was known as a hymn writer. So young Samuel Cartledge would have been born into a frontier Anglican home, though his later life suggests that his upbringing wasn't entirely without Quaker influence or something like it. Sometime before 1762, Edmund III joined a band of other southbound migrants, gathered his family once again, and moved south. This time, he traveled on through South Carolina and settled on what is now called Buies Creek, a branch of the Savannah River near present-day Augusta, Georgia. Here, he and his sons obtained land and lived as planters in Columbia County, not far from the Georgia-South Carolina line. And it was here on the Buies that young Samuel grew to manhood. His family seems to have remained Anglican throughout his youth, for his father was commissioned as a captain in the king's militia, and apparently at least one of his sons served as a king's constable. As Samuel approached his 21st year, however, he was confronted by the heartwarming gospel of a New Life missionary named Daniel+Marshall, and his life would never be the same again. Marshall, as you probably know, was a native of Connecticut who had an intriguing religious history of his own. After a life of congregationalism, he was filled with holy zeal at the age of 38 as a result of George Whitefield's powerful Calvinistic preaching. And Marshall later married Martha+Stearns, as you know, the sister of Stearns, who influenced him to join the separate Baptist movement. He and Martha served some time as missionaries among the Indians before joining Schubel on a southward migration to North Carolina. Marshall worked with Stearns for some years here in North Carolina. He was ordained after some difficulty because he let his wife pray and speak in church, and they had a hard time finding two Baptist preachers that would agree on his ordination. But he did finally get ordained and served as pastor of Buies Creek, even though at least one early Baptist pastor thought very little of his abilities. I found this quote interesting in a book that Lydia recently shared with me. Morgan Edwards, who was a minister in the Philadelphia Association, wrote a manuscript history that he never managed to publish. In it he said that Daniel+Marshall was a man of no bright parts, nor eloquence, nor learning. Piety, earnestness, and honesty are all he can boast of. I suppose many of us would be happy if we could boast of piety, earnestness, and honesty. Well, Marshall eventually moved south as well, establishing churches in South Carolina and spending time there before extending his evangelistic efforts to Georgia. Now, a Georgia law of 1757 prohibited any worship not according to the rites and ceremonies of the Church of England, so it was technically illegal to hold Baptist services in the colony. Nevertheless, in or about 1770, Marshall put the law to the test by leaving his settlement in Horse Creek, South Carolina, crossing the Savannah River, and daring to preach in the royal colony of Georgia. On one occasion, apparently, as Marshall led a brush arbor meeting near Buies Creek, he was apparently arrested by a stern constable for preaching a doctrine contrary to the Anglican Church. The most common strand of tradition identifies this stern constable as Samuel Cartledge. There is, however, some confusion on the subject which deserves picking at for a little bit. This prevalent tradition was preserved by Samuel Boykin in his History of the Baptist Denomination in Georgia, 1881, more than 100 years after the fact, and it was later copied by B.F. Riley in his History of the Baptist of the Southern States East of the Mississippi in 1898. Riley liked to add flourishes and make things a little more exciting. And as he tells the story, Marshall was conducting religious services in a grove of trees, and then, while upon his knees offering the opening prayer, he was suddenly interrupted by a heavy hand being laid upon his shoulder with the exclamation, "You are my prisoner." Rising from the posture of devotion, the venerable man of God with benignant face and snow-white hair, I don't know where he saw the picture, stood front to front with a stern officer of the law. The devout preacher was informed that he had preached in the parish of St. Paul. After giving security for his presence in court the next day, Riley relates, Marshall continued the service. Appearing in court, Marshall was ordered to leave Georgia and not return in the capacity of a preacher. But in response, according to Marshall's son Abraham, who later became a preacher in his own right, Daniel+Marshall boldly quoted the apostle, "Whether it be right to obey God or man, judge ye." And fearlessly disregarding the existing statute, the preacher-prisoner continued to persistently proclaim the gospel. Mrs. Marshall reportedly expressed the indignation of fellow onlookers by forcefully lecturing the officers of the law. She fluently quoted passage after passage of Scripture in support of her husband's doctrine, and then, according to Riley, the stern constable, Samuel+Cartledge, was so impressed by the inspired words to which she gave utterance that he was pricked to the heart and was ultimately led to Christ out of that Anglican heresy. Several subsequent sketches have accepted this and similar accounts at face value. You might raise the question of noticing that Samuel would have been only 21 years old in 1770. Now, I grant kids grew up a lot faster then than they do now. We have to ask, at 21, would he have been such a stern constable with such a heavy hand? There are actually other accounts. Writing 34 years earlier than Boykin, Jesse Campbell gave a different view. In Georgia Baptist Historical and Biographical in 1847, Campbell says that Marshall first preached in private houses. But, quoting Campbell, about his second or third visit, he had a meeting in the woods under a grove. And while engaged in prayer in the opening of the service, he was arrested by Constable Cartledge, parentheses, he adds, afterwards a physician, and baptized by Mr. Marshall, and who continued steadfast in the faith till his death in 1825. And security for his appearance was given by Hugh Middleton, who resided just across the Savannah on the South Carolina side. Mrs. Marshall, who was present, quoted several texts of Scripture with so much force as to confound the opposers and convict several persons. The services went on, and after preaching, 2 persons were baptized. Campbell then gives a similar account of the following trial. The notable difference is that Campbell identifies Constable Cartledge as a physician. Campbell also knew of Samuel+Cartledge, but did not identify him as either a constable or a physician, only as a minister. Unfortunately, Campbell mentioned Dr. Cartledge within his larger biographical sketch of Samuel, thinking perhaps that the doctor, not being a religious leader, did not deserve an individual sketch. Boykin was familiar with Campbell's work, and he cited Campbell's authority in his version of the story, but apparently failed to make the distinction between the 2 men, and so he identified Samuel as the Cartledge, as the constable, rather. Now, there was a Dr. Cartledge in the area at the time. He was Samuel's brother, Edmund number 4, who became a well-known surgeon and Baptist layman in the vicinity, although the date Campbell gives for his wife is incorrect. Edmund IV would have been 24 years old in 1770, and perhaps would have been a better candidate as the stern constable. Yet a third account is found in a little-known and unpublished autobiography of Samuel's grandson, Reverend Abiah Morgan Cartledge. He was known as A.M. Cartledge, born in 1817. He knew Samuel personally and was, in fact, baptized by him. As an aspiring young minister, he must have spent many hours with his grandfather, who lived with A.M.'s family prior to his death in 1843. Writing at the age of 77, A.M. gave this account of his grandfather's Baptist conversion. He said, "On one occasion, Daniel+Marshall had an appointment to preach at a certain place. Grandfather's brother, James, who was a state constable, received orders to go and arrest him." James is the one I'm descended from. Grandfather went with him, but when they arrived at the place, Marshall had commenced the services for the occasion, and they concluded not to arrest him until after the close of the exercises. They both became deeply convicted under the sermon. The arrestors were arrested. They left after asking Marshall to pray for them. They were both finally converted and became Baptists. Well, this account contains two important divergences. First, the writer asserts that the constable was another of Samuel's brother, James. That has to be a little unlikely, however. According to his Revolutionary War records, James was born September 18, 1755, and thus he would have only been 14 or 15 years old at the time of Marshall's arrest. It's more likely that Samuel would have gone with an older brother, Edmund, than his younger brother, James. A.M. has been known to be wrong on other details. He was 77 when he was writing, and he apparently erred here. However, his assertion that Samuel went with a brother could add some weight to Campbell's claim that the constable was Edmund. The problem is further complicated in that neither James, Samuel, nor Edmund has been found listed as a constable in colonial records. Constables may not have been listed in all the commission books, but we do have records that their father, Edmund III, was listed as a captain in the king's militia. As such, he may have had power to deputize any or all of his sons to carry out such a task as Marshall's arrest. So it's feasible then that all of the brothers could have been constables for a day, or that Samuel's father, Edmund III, could have been the stern constable. But what's to be made of A.M.'s claim that the brothers did not actually arrest Marshall? The grandson may have desired to be kind to his grandfather, for the tradition of Marshall's arrest and court appearance seems to be too strong to have no basis. Even so, it appears the arrest was a quite informal affair. Hugh Middleton was allowed to serve as security for Marshall, even though he was a sympathetic listener, and not only that, but a resident of South Carolina. Middleton served as a justice of the peace, so he would probably have been Anglican, but two of his family members were reportedly baptized during the service in question. After the notification of arrest, all accounts agree that Marshall was allowed to continue the service, and then following the trial, he continued to defy the law, and no action was taken beyond the verbal scolding administered at the trial. Citing additional information, Waldo Harris argued convincingly that the arrest was more of a church affair than a legal one, probably brought about at the request of Edward Ellington, who was pastor of St. Paul's Anglican Church at the time. He was present at the trial and had close relations with other ranking officers in Augusta. So it may well be that the trial was more of a church affair, and that could be why there's no record of it in the official court records. In any case, the trial apparently carried little legal weight, for Marshall moved to Georgia within the year and founded Cahokia Baptist Church shortly thereafter. There is one more tradition. A letter from Cora Marshall, who was a direct descendant of Daniel Marshall, claims that Marshall was not only caught but horsewhipped for preaching the gospel on the famous Cedar Rock by a man named Cartledge, who was a Tory. This widely divergent account has little corroborating support, and it doesn't specify which man named Cartledge was involved in the horsewhipping, so it is of little value for the present discussion. Marshall's son Abraham wrote of the incident, and I suspect he would have known who the constable was, but he didn't say, and I suspect if there had been a horsewhipping, he would have mentioned that. Demonstrable proof, then, for the identification of the stern constable as Samuel is lacking, but several things appear to be evident. Daniel Marshall was arrested after a fashion by someone named Cartledge, and Samuel must have been present. He heard both the heartwarming message by Daniel Marshall and the bone-rattling denunciation by Martha+Stearns+Marshall. Samuel must have been deeply impressed with the urgent Baptist message. He was somewhat slow in following up on his experience, but he did not forget it. In 1777, he was baptized by Marshall and soon ordained as a deacon in the Cahokia Baptist Church. His brothers James, Edmund IV, and Joseph also became Baptists and leaders of Cahokia and other nearby churches. Although A.M. Cartledge contends that his father started preaching at the age of 23, which would be 4 years before his baptism, no other record lists such an early beginning in ministry. For several years, Samuel worked under the spiritual tutelage of Daniel Marshall as one of several licentiates. After training them in both doctrine and the work of the church, Marshall would send the young men out as pastors of newly constituted churches. After his ordination in 1789, at the age of 39, Samuel assumed the pastorate of Callaham's Mill Church in 1790. He moved his family there to the Edgefield district of South Carolina and served that church, which is now called Parksville Baptist Church, near present-day McCormick, South Carolina, for more than 50 years, until his death in 1843. The church's records indicate he became pastor in 1790, but he wasn't officially received as a new member in the Georgia Association until 1792. At that point, some churches in South Carolina were members of the Georgia Association, which is interesting. Few churches had services every week, so pastors often served several churches simultaneously, as you know. Samuel was no exception. In 1792, he became pastor of nearby Plum Branch Baptist, and with the exception of a few years, he also served there for the last 50 years of his life. It's probably thought that services were held there once a month on both Saturday and Sunday, as was typical. Samuel served at least 3 other churches, but it's not clear how many years he remained at those. He's on the list of pastors from Big Stevens Creek Church in South Carolina. He was the first pastor of Old Damascus Church in Columbia County, Georgia, after founding it along with Elder W. Hillman. And R.L. Robinson's History of the Georgia Baptist Association says he worked there for 19 years, close to his original Georgia home. And finally, the aging minister became pastor of the Red Oak Grove Church, which he had helped found in 1812. He became pastor in 1822 and served for an uncertain duration. He served faithfully in those churches, though often without impressive results. Relatively complete records of the Callaham's Mill Church offer a representative picture. The membership varied each year, according to the records, always being less than 100 until the Great Revival of 1831. In 1818, the total was 87, with 1 having been received by baptism and 1 by letter. In 1823, there were 72 listed, with only 1 having been baptized. In 1827, the number had dropped to 68. However, the revival fires had started to burn by 1829, and there were 163 listed as members. By 1830, with 21 baptisms, the membership had reached 183. Then in 1831, when the entire association seemed on fire for the Lord, there were 38 baptisms at Callaham's Mill. The total membership had reached 202, according to the State of the Church's report. The association meeting in 1838, there had been a drop to 169 from 184 the previous year. That's from some records by Woodson. Samuel would have been 80 years old in 1830 during the heat of the revival, and he must have felt that the harvest was finally at hand. During that revival, he baptized his previously mentioned grandson, A.M. Cartledge, who went on to become a Baptist pastor of some repute near Winsboro, South Carolina. In his memoirs, A.M. Cartledge described his experience this way: "There was a remarkable revival of religion pretty much all over the country. A series of meetings in the day and at night was held at Callahan's church, which continued for 2 weeks. A large number, especially of the young persons, became convicted and converted and were baptized, and I was among them." Samuel helped plant churches as well as to pastor them. The evangelistic zeal he inherited from Daniel+Marshall's separate Baptist preaching caused him to seek opportunities to establish churches wherever possible. And while it's not certain how much of a role he played, he participated in the founding of several churches, including the Republican Church in 1805, the Red Oak Grove Church in 1812, the Rehoboth Church in 1833, and the Red Hill Church in 1835. All of those were in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. We've already mentioned that he participated in founding the Damascus Church in Columbia County, Georgia. And those are from records from those 2 associations where we know he was involved. If we were to look at other nearby associations, we might find his name again, but I haven't done that. You might be interested in something about his character. I was, and so you have to be for the next few minutes. I think we can glean something about the nature of his character from the long-term nature of his pastorate. It's 50 years, which suggests that he was loved and respected by his parishioners. Fortunately, we also possess a variety of stories that give some shape and color to the picture of Samuel's beliefs and practices and personality. His great-nephew, Groves Harrison Cartledge, sought to preserve the old pastor's legacy in some writings, and he preserved this delightful anecdote. He said of Samuel, he was possessed of the characteristics of the Welsh people, a ready wit, plainness of speech, frankness, and candor. He would relate in the pulpit or anywhere else the meanest act he ever did or the meanest thought that ever entered his head. For example, in his old age, after he had buried the wife of his youth, he was sent to pray for a very sick parishioner in middle life. While on his knees praying, he was observed by those present to be laboring under difficulties, as if embarrassed and burdened. And when he had finished, he sat with bowed head for a moment, and then said to the wife of the sick man, "My sister, all the time I was trying to pray for your husband, and trying to pray in faith, the devil was whispering in my ear, saying, 'Now, Daddy Cartledge, pray without faith, and the sick man will die, and you can marry the widow.'" Although he was evidently tempted, as is common to all persons, Samuel was indeed a pious and devoted minister. The pietism of his Quaker forebears and early Baptist training are quite evident in this excerpt from his obituary. He was for nearly 70 years a pious, this by the way is from the Edgefield Advertiser, a pious and devoted minister of the gospel. Although of limited education, I don't know if he had any bright parts either, his extensive usefulness has never been questioned. Thousands who have long since gone to their heavenly home will rise up and bless the memory of the sainted patriarch who under God was the great instrument of their eternal happiness. And other thousands will admire, if not follow, his example. His zeal and piety uniformly kept pace with each other, and it is difficult to determine in which he excelled. Neither of them was of a periodical cast or nature. They exhibited themselves not by fits and starts, as is often the case with both ministers and laymen, but as fixed and constant principles of true and hourly devotion. His piety was not a meteor blaze or an exhalation that flits across the miasma, but an ever-growing light, fit guide to heaven, and a blissful immortality, such too is gained upon the respect even of the profligate and abandoned. He affected nothing. Religion was his great theme to the last. Wherever he went, religion was invariably the most prominent topic of conversation. And if at any time he discoursed on other matters, it was because these subjects interested others and not him. He seldom had an interview with any person to whom he did not introduce the subject of religion before parting. It was his custom, as long as his health would permit, never to eat or drink a mouthful in the morning until he had first addressed the throne of grace, nor would he lie down at night without enjoying the same duty. I think that writer was getting paid by the word. Maybe a frustrated poet as well. Some exaggeration in this eloquent tribute to the deceased saint may be expected, but even so, a picture of remarkable piety and devotion becomes evident. Samuel's preaching, as well as his piety, was characteristic of the early separate Baptist. True to its Puritan roots, it was warm and it cut to the heart. It was consistently grounded in Scripture. His grandson A.M. remarked, his knowledge of the Bible was remarkable. His sermons were interwoven with passages of Scripture, accurately quoted and illustrative of the views presented. Through his humble background as a farmer and a cobbler, Samuel could easily relate to his rural congregations, and he often used illustrations from their common experience in nature to clarify his message and to convict his hearers. Stories from his brief service in the Revolutionary War were special favorites, and he took pride in having served his newly independent country. In cautioning his congregation against placing too much confidence in self, Samuel would relate a story of a man who frequently bragged about what he would do if his company were engaged in battle. On one occasion, A.M. writes, orders were received from headquarters to prepare rations for a day. This was understood by all to mean that a battle was expected the next day. This man, who was all the time boasting, in preparing his rations, baked a large ash pone, and when he had washed it, he put it in the pocket of a long surtout coat that he wore. Sure enough, the battle came on. And brethren, what do you think? This man was the very first man to run. and in his escape he had to climb over a tall rail fence. Having reached the top, he made a leap for the ground, but his heavy ash pone, hanging back for a moment over the top of the fence, came down with considerable force and struck him on the head. Said he, "I surrender, sir." He was thus surrendered to his own ash pone, thinking the enemy had struck him. A.M., who had often heard his grandfather preach in such a matter, then relates, "Some of the people in the congregation would of course laugh, and my grandfather would rather smile. And at this point he would pause for a moment, and then with a sad countenance and deeply feeling tone in his voice, he would say, 'Ah, my brethren, this is too much the way with some of us. We have great confidence in our strength, but when Satan assails us with his temptations, we are the first to yield. Oh, let us never forget that in God is our strength.'" Tears would now be flowing in the eyes of many, A.M. said, who had been laughing just a few minutes before. A firm belief in the sufficiency of God through Christ, the depravity of humans, the reality of Satan, and the importance of a holy life seemed to characterize much of Samuel's emphasis in preaching. Perhaps as a result of his involvement in the earlier arrest of Daniel+Marshall, he was keenly aware of the dangers of pride and the inherent shortcomings of humankind. He often illustrated this with a lesson from nature as remembered by his grandson. Excuse me. Speaking of pride, my grandfather would say, "We have nothing to be proud of, but much to humble us. We have seen that beautiful fowl, the peacock, with his tail raised and spread, strutting from side to side, as though he would display it to the greatest advantage, his beautiful plume. All at once, we have seen him appear to look down at his long, rusty legs and droop his feathers. And then he would say with deep solemnity, 'Ah, my friend, thus it would be with any of us who strut about in our pride, if we would only look at it and consider our ugly thoughts and our very ugly actions, we should find enough to humble us.'" I've already noted Samuel's zeal for evangelism. In 1823, he preached a introductory sermon for the annual meeting of the Edgefield Baptist Association. He addressed that body of messengers from the churches with a text from Acts 26, 28, and 29, "Almost thou persuaded me to be a Christian." Apparently, even in an associational meeting, he was confident there were sinners in need of repentance who needed yet to be persuaded. Apparently, his compassionate and fervent preaching lost none of its vigor in his advancing years. The minutes of the Georgia Association for 1839 attest that the meeting was affectionately and impressively addressed by our old Father Cartledge, now in his 90th year. In both preaching and piety, Samuel was the quintessential early Baptist pastor. It'd be in order to briefly mention his personal life. He owned land on Greenbrier Creek near Cahokie and became a close friend of Daniel and Martha and Abraham Marshall. But after accepting the pastor of Callahan's church, he moved to Edgefield County and lived there most of his remaining life. He married twice and outlived both wives. His first wife, Elizabeth, bore at least 5 children to him: Isaiah, John, Elizabeth, Jeremiah, and Samuel Jr. Biblical names of the children suggest further evidence of Samuel's deeply rooted piety. After Elizabeth's death, he married a woman named Nancy, and that's about all we know about her. She apparently had no children and also preceded him in death. As he advanced in years, Samuel made his home with a son, John V. Cartledge, who was the father of A.M. Cartledge. He became subject to 6 spells, but that did not prevent him from traveling on horseback to carry out his work as pastor. At the age of 93, the old parson decided to visit relatives in Georgia, and some say to preach as well. On his return, he spent the final night of his journey with Dr. Nathaniel Crawford. My father's middle name is Crawford. A friend whose home was near Pace's Ferry, a local passage across the Savannah River. The next morning was July 13, 1843. As Samuel bade his friend farewell and approached the ferry through a long meadow lane, his horse was spooked by a stray jackass. Samuel managed to quiet his horse and turn back toward the ferry, but the steed once again turned to take flight. Samuel's leg was caught against a corner fence post, and he was thrown violently to the ground. Dr. Crawford arrived on the scene only in time to see his friend's last breath. Oh, to be able to ride a horse at 93, even if it kills you. Friends considered his sudden and apparently painless death to be providential. They had often heard Samuel say, "I'm more than willing to die. I feel that to be absent from the body and present with the Lord would be far better. For me to live as Christ and to die at gain is gain. But if it be the will of God, I would greatly prefer to die suddenly and be relieved from a long period of suffering and helplessness." That morning of his death, he had quoted those very passages to Dr. Crawford as he led morning devotions for the family. Well, Samuel was buried in the family burying ground of his brother James in Columbia County, but he was not soon forgotten. When the Edgefield Association met the following September at Salem Church, resolutions were adopted in honor of our beloved and venerable father in the gospel, Elder S. Cartledge. On Monday of the meeting, the association adjourned and with uncovered heads marched in slow and solemn procession from the house to the stand, singing hymn 662, Watts and Ribbon, Why Do We Mourn Departing Friends. The moderator, Reverend J.M. Childs, preached the funeral sermon from 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought a good fight. Indeed, Samuel had fought a good fight and a long one. But there was more to tie him to St. Paul than an appropriately chosen text for his funeral. Samuel, like Saul, had been a member of the established church and had persecuted those who followed a new and different faith, ironically, in the parish of St. Paul. As Saul had experienced God through a great light from heaven on the road to Damascus, Samuel was confronted with the gospel through a new light missionary. Samuel, like Saul, traveled much, served tirelessly, evangelized fervently, loved his people like children, and led a piously devoted life. His peers occasionally referred to him as Saul of Tarsus. His own frequent quotations from and allusions to St. Paul make it clear that he personally admired the famous apostle and may have styled his ministry in part after him. Perhaps the most significant evidence of that is found in that small church in Columbia County, the church for which we have the greatest verifiable evidence of his participation from its founding is located only a short distance from where Samuel first saw the light, and one could contend that it was he, the founder and first pastor, who decided that it should be named Damascus. Several parallel events then, similar qualities and an equal love of Christ, joined Samuel Cartledge with St. Paul to produce a true colonial Saul of Tarsus. But he never may have come to faith if it hadn't been for a colonial Priscilla and Aquila, for Daniel and Martha+Marshall, who led him to faith. And chances are, this pastor, preacher, journalist, professor, writer might have been traveling some path other than the Baptist highway if that committed couple's fiery commitment and long-lasting legacy had not reached out to Samuel Cartledge 6 or 7 generations before. Thank you so much for your attention.
We have time for a couple of questions. If you have them, I'm still kind of caught up in the whole story. Maybe you are too. But if you have some questions for Tony, please fire away.
I can look at the footnotes beyond that. I don't know.
That's right. Bring the long arm of, I don't know. Anybody have a question? Are you already thinking about supper? So which story do you think was the true story? Or is it some mixture of all the stories?
I think it's got to be some mixture of them. I think there was more than one involved, and I think Samuel was there.
After
Beyond
that?
that, I don't know.
What I think is curious is, we would, if we just had one of those accounts, we would just assume that one account was more or less right. But we have 4 or 5 or a bunch of accounts, so.
I think the fact that Boykin apparently misunderstood Campbell is interesting to see how that picks up guy. That's really where Samuel's first name. And it's really the only one in which Samuel is named the constant. The only others say it was one of Samuel's brothers. Except Cora, who just says it was a man part of the Jewish people.
Just say.
With a horse whip.
Yes.
Do you have any idea what would have been involved in his apprenticeship to the Marshalls?
From my reading, it was only that he would go around with them as they preached and listen, and I suppose get an opportunity to preach here and there. And it was just kind of personal mentorship, as I understand it. I don't know if it was a standard 10-year period or if that's just how long he served before Marshall cut him loose.
Do you know if it might have involved assigned reading or anything like that?
I have no idea. I don't know how much reading was available. So I don't know any more about it than that. Yeah.
Now, I was curious, did any of these guys have connections with the English Baptists? Or is this all indigenous American development?
All I know of it is indigenous America. You know, once you get to Georgia, I don't know if there were any other connections.
You know, where you would have some kind of connection,
I mean,
in the Northeast and stuff.
Right. Well, you know, back in North Carolina with Buies-Creek, there were some connections with a pastor at Jersey, you know, who was more from the Charleston tradition. But as far as any direct connection with English Baptists, I'm not familiar with.
Okay, well, thank you so much.